Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. I'm Vince. Today I'm going to look at the book How Jesus Became God by Bart Ehrman. This is generally what I do on my channel, so if you're looking for some good explanations of important books or ideas, check it out and possibly subscribe. As a precursor to this video and as an introduction, I did a short video on things that I think are important to remember when reading Ehrman. It's not essential to watch before this one, but I think it does answer some questions that might be brought up, so you might check that out too. Okay, I think the best way to start this video is by highlighting, as he does over and over again, what exactly he is trying to do here. Like, what is his thesis? But maybe more importantly, what is he not trying to do? If I had to give a 10-word summary of what he is trying to do in this book, it is, he wants to investigate how it is that Jesus came to be thought of as God. I don't know if that was 10 words or not, and I refuse to go back and count, so you're welcome to do that if you would like. What he's not doing, and this will probably be irritating to some of you watching this and liberating for others, is he is not trying to talk about if Jesus actually was God. What is the reality of that spiritual realm? Like, was Jesus a man who actually became God, or even just Jesus a man who became a God? That's certainly a question that is outside the realm of history and firmly in the realm of religion and faith. It's always funny to me that some Christians are scared of Bart because they think he is attacking their faith, and some non-Christians find a hero in Bart pretty much for the same reasons. They think he is attacking the Christian faith. But he's not doing either. In fact, he specifically says he framed his conclusion in such a way that it was specifically not challenging to Christian theology. And there's a very good reason for this. He doesn't care about Christian theology. Kind of. I mean, he obviously has something to say about it. And like I mentioned in my last video, like all historians, he does have a bias. But he does, in my opinion, a very good job of controlling them, and he operates here as a historian. And in fact, none of what Ehrman says in this book is actually new to him. He is basically summarizing what a lot of historians have said in the past, including Christian historians. So remember, this is a trade book meant to make all of these scholarly ideas known to a popular audience, something that Ehrman is great at. This is not a scholarly book written for the academy. Something else, by the way, that Ehrman is great at. So his question is a question about history. Questions about what Jesus's actual spiritual nature was are outside of the realm of history. Now, I'm stressing this because the book can get kind of confusing if you don't keep these two things separated. The second thing I want to stress is about the title is that to ancients, and he explains this also, they thought of God or gods a lot differently than we do. There was not just like us and God, like there's a line here and then humans are down here and God is up here. In the ancients, it was more like a pyramid with humans at the lowest level and then God on the highest level, and then there was like a bunch of steps in between, so that human rulers, for instance, like Caesar, were considered a god, but they would be like the lowest tier. But so that they wouldn't have been considered like as high as, say, Zeus. Okay, so Ehrman is not just interested in how Jesus became thought of as a god like Caesar. He's interested in when Jesus climbed that ladder, as it were, and started to be thought of as the God at the very top. All right, so I gave my 10 or so words of what Ehrman's trying to do here. He's investigating when and how it was that Jesus started to be thought of as God. And so here's my similarly very brief answer. Bart thinks that it was the belief in the resurrection that convinced his followers that he was a God. And over time, this thought developed into a belief that he was the God that most Christians believe in today. Okay, so I'm going to number my points here that I got out of the book. This is not something that he does, but it'll help me as I go along and maybe help you as you go along through this video. First, and probably his most controversial part of this book, is what about Jesus' life? Like, why didn't his disciples believe that he was God when he was on earth? I mean, didn't he tell them he was God? What Ehrman would say is, and again, this is with the backing of most critical scholars. So I'm going to keep making that point that he's not just like out on a limb here saying things that are just weird and out there, or radical, as it were. Like, he agrees with most critical scholars. Jesus didn't actually call himself God. The verses that say he did were put on his lips by later authors. The biggest reason for thinking this is that in the first three Gospels, which are also thought of as the most historical, Jesus never says he was a God. He does talk about being the Messiah, but these two figures are not the same. The Messiah is just a figure that God raises up and anoints to do God's purposes. So ancient kings of Israel were also called Messiah, as was the king of Persia, King Cyrus. So Messiah doesn't mean God. But in the first three Gospels, he never says he is God. In fact, he does talk about this heavenly figure called the Son of Man, but whenever he talks about the Son of Man, he talks about the Son of Man in the third person. And that leads Ehrman and other scholars to believe that Jesus is looking forward to someone else. John is the only gospel where Jesus talks about being God, and I hear this so much. Well, Ehrman doesn't know what he's talking about because look, and then they quote John. Yes, in John, Jesus does say that, but almost all critical scholars agree that John was not written until about 70 years after Jesus, and it is the least historical. Okay, so that deals with that. What about this resurrection business? Point 2. Ehrman says, look, there's no getting around it. His followers believed that he was raised from the grave. Like, if you like it or not, that's what his followers believed. He says that they had these visions about that Jesus was risen, and that's really all that historians can say about that. Again, the argument is not whether or not Jesus actually resurrected. That's a theological claim. Historians can say nothing about whether Jesus actually resurrected or not. Now, to be sure, there are some evangelicals who would strongly disagree with what I just said. They say that they can actually prove that Jesus was raised from the dead, but I don't know anyone who is not an evangelical who would actually call that scholarship. I mean, the very nature of history, just like the nature of science, is that it looks for the most probable natural causes. Like, definitionally, it excludes miracles. Well, now, you can argue whether you like that or not, but that is a definitional argument. I don't know. Maybe that's just my bias, but I feel like, no, that's probably not real scholarship to say I can prove miracles happened 2,000 years ago. The controversy that's made in this point about the resurrection of Jesus and Christians saying that they experienced the resurrected Christ is about the empty tomb. Was there an empty tomb or not? Many historians believe that there was an actual tomb and that it was actually empty, and that's what started this belief about Jesus being raised. Ehrman said that as a historian, he used to believe that too, until he did research on this book. He said upon reflection, even if there was an empty tomb, it wouldn't convince anyone. I mean, look at the New Testament. When the first people see the empty tomb, they don't say, oh, Jesus is risen. They say, oh, the Romans must have moved the body. So it doesn't make anybody assume that Jesus raised from the dead just by seeing an empty tomb. Like if I went to my grandpa's grave and it was dug up and the coffin was empty, I'm not going to say, oh my gosh, my grandpa raised from the grave. Rose from the grave. So fair enough, right? The empty tomb is not going to convince anyone. Ehrman says it was not the empty tomb, but it was visions that convinced them that Jesus had risen. Okay, third, they had these visions and they began to believe that he was raised. How does that make him God? Well, as it happens, one of the ways that ancients believed that humans, crossed that dividing line and they could become in the God sphere is that God, like the God, would adopt them into godhood. To Ehrman, this is what the earliest Christians believed. He finds this in what scholars have identified as pre-Pauline traditions that Paul included in his letters. So when you're reading through Paul's letters, there are these little like poems or hymns that scholars would say, oh, this is something that was written before Paul and Paul included in his letters. One of these, for instance, is found in Philippians chapter 2. In that hymn, it says that Jesus was obedient to God even unto death. Therefore, it's because of his obedience unto death that God raised him up and gave him the name above every name. It's really hard to read those verses in Philippians without seeing that it says, because of this, God did this, right? Like, because he was obedient, he was raised up. And so that might get you to start thinking, hey, it looks like some kind of adoptionistic thing is happening here. Again, in Romans 1:4, that's another one of these pre-Pauline traditions. It says, and who through the Spirit of holiness was appointed the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. So again, like this adoptionist exaltation view. So essentially, this is the start of the answer to the question. In the earliest Christian view, says Ehrman, Jesus became God, or at least a God, when the Christians became convinced that he was raised from the dead. Okay, so now we're at divine. How do we get to God? Fourth point. What Ehrman says is, after Christians came to believe that Jesus was divine, there was an evolution of thought where, as time went on, they started pushing his divinity back further and further in time. And there's kind of a nice correlation here. Like in these passages that scholars think are pre-Pauline, and in Paul's letters, which are the earliest books of the Bible, we get this idea that Jesus became God at his resurrection. So again, he was adopted, or he was exalted. Jesus became God because God exalted him. In Mark, the earliest gospel written after Paul, we get this idea that Jesus became God not at his resurrection, but now at his baptism. So it's pushed back just a little bit. So in Mark, Jesus gets baptized, the skies open up, and God says some words to Jesus. What does he say? Well, one textual variant, which Ehrman thinks is the original text, God says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." By the way, he deals with that passage in one of his books called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, and I summarize that on my channel too. If you're interested, check it out. And I also deal with that in a short video I did as an introduction to textual criticism. So again, if you're interested, have at it. So in Mark, we have this adoptionist exaltation view, but now Christians seem to believe that Jesus became God at his baptism. In Matthew and Luke, written a little bit after Mark, the thought that Jesus was God evolved into Jesus being God at his birth. So that now, like in Luke, God overtakes Mary and impregnates her, much like the Greek gods did to earthly women. And in Matthew, Jesus is called God with us from his birth. So now it's not an adoptionist exaltation view, but now Jesus is viewed as a literal Son of God. And that happens at his birth. And then finally we get to the last gospel written, which is John, and Jesus is this pre-existent deity. It's pushed back so far, it's before his life, right? It's from the beginning, like it starts off. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the evolution here is that it goes from exaltation, God at his resurrection, exaltation, God at baptism, and to an incarnation view, God from birth, to a pre-existent view, God from the beginning. And so now, we're at pre-existence. We can't go back any further than that. Or can we? So here's where we get to Nicaea. And we can call this point 5. The question is then asked by the church, was there ever a time when God existed and Jesus did not exist? So, was Jesus created? And ultimately, the church votes on this, and they vote overwhelmingly and almost unanimously that Jesus was, in fact, always with God. Jesus is God. Of course, it didn't hurt that by this time, the Emperor of Rome, Constantine, had converted to Christianity and strongly urged, upon penalty of exile, everyone to agree. So that really helped the vote to be close to unanimous. And thus was born the concept of the Trinity. And that is, Jesus and God are the same, but they are also different. If you try to understand it, you can't. Which is very convenient in my opinion. Believe what I tell you to believe, or else. Okay, what should I believe? I just told you, whatever I say. because if you ask any questions about what I say, you don't really believe it because it's an impossible mystery to understand. Okay, point number 6, and this one I think Bart would say is the most important point, and I certainly agree. Like, I hope that, I wish that if I could tell the world one thing, right, about Christians, it would be this point. What I just spelled out to you about the development of Jesus and God and all that, this is not what all Christians today believe. And it's not what all Christians throughout time believed. What Ehrman did was to spell out for us how what eventually became the Orthodox view came about. Along every step of the way, and even today, people who claim to follow Jesus, who would call themselves Christians, disagree. Some believe that Jesus was fully God. Some believe that Jesus was fully human. Others really don't care, but care more about Jesus' teaching. And in the book, if you're interested, he gives very good descriptions of these. So again, the big point is Christians fought over these understandings. It was never a monolith. This is why I get so irritated when people today say, oh, well, those Christians think. No, you can say those Catholics think or those evangelicals think, but you can't say that all Christians think, because all Christians have never agreed on anything. And in fact, it's really only the ones in power and backed by the power of the state or who have a lot of money that came up with what is orthodoxy. So one can make a very good argument that the ones that were declared heretics, that those were the real Christians. I'm just saying. So, in the last couple of chapters, he talks about the development of orthodoxy, and I think I can give a really good summary of it by just saying that those who supported what eventually became orthodoxy didn't really have a good grasp of what they believed. They just knew what they didn't believe, and that is anything on the extreme. So if someone said, well, Jesus was fully human, they could say, no, he was God. But if they said, well, he was fully God, they could say, no, he was human. And so they really just refused to be narrowed down and ultimately just said, mystery. Okay, last point, and this is after the historical investigation. Ehrman ends the book with an epilogue. And for those of you who questioned me in my last video about giving evidence of his biases, here is where he shows his bias. So the epilogue is basically saying, one of the consequences of the church declaring Jesus as God is that now they say Jews killed God. Like, they didn't just kill Jesus, they didn't just kill a man, they killed a deity. And in fact, they killed the deity. And so the church used this to validate their anti-Semitism, or at least this has been used to validate anti-Semitism. So Ehrman kind of links these two views together, the Trinity and anti-Semitism. On the surface, it sounds very plausible, and it certainly could have been what happened. The church could be to blame for anti-Semitism because of this developed view of Jesus. I'm not trying to stick up for the Trinity here, or the church for that matter. I'm just saying that it's certainly not the only, or in my opinion, even the most likely view. Maybe the lesson of the Gospels is that it was not the Jews that killed God, but the desire for political power that killed God. And here, the church is still wrong, but not because of their views on the Trinity, but because they scapegoated the Jews. Maybe even in order to gain their own political power. Maybe Jesus had to die, as a lot of evangelicals would say, and maybe it's precisely because he was God. And so Jews were a powerful force that God used to accomplish God's will. Maybe we should be praising them for their faithfulness. Or maybe the Jews really should be blamed for killing the one true God, and we should all hate them. But then we realize that Jesus says to forgive your enemies, and so all of a sudden it occurs to us that someone had to commit the ultimate transgression so that we could learn how to ultimately forgive. Wow, what a sermon that would bring, right? Again, I'm not advocating for any of those. I'm not saying any of those is correct. I'm just saying that when reading Ehrman, you do need to realize that even though he does, in my opinion, a very good job of hiding it, he does have his biases. All right. That is Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God, the way that I see it. I hope you enjoyed that summary. If so, I invite you to check out and subscribe to my page. In particular, if you enjoyed this video, you might like my summary of Jürgen Moltmann's The Crucified God. Check it out. If I can figure out how to do it, I will add an ending screen you can click on right here. Did I do it?